In 1970s England, the air was thick with despair. Great Britain stood on the brink of collapse. The streets were overrun not just by rats, but by striking workers, disillusioned youth, and those whom society had long since abandoned. In the dark alleyways, lost souls drifted through the night, while unemployment devoured what little hope remained of a brighter future. In this bleak and broken landscape, anarchy wasn't some distant whisper from the past. It was a deafening scream rising from the heart of a nation in turmoil. For those unfortunate enough to be born on the wrong side of the tracks, the future was like a shattered mirror, fragmented, cruel, and hopeless. And it was in this storm of discontent that, on a cold December night in 1976, British television was about to make history, or, in the eyes of some, commit an unforgivable mistake. The Today Show, hosted by the well-mannered Bill Grundy, was usually mundane and predictable. But that night promised something special, a live interview with the legendary Queen. Fate, however, or perhaps bad luck, had other plans. At the last minute, Queen canceled. With no time to spare, desperate producers scrambled to fill the void. What they found was a raw, dangerous new act rising from the London underground. A band of rebellious punks known simply as the Sex Pistols. They didn't walk into the studio that night, they stormed in, a hurricane of leather, sneers, and defiance. And they weren't alone. Tagging along was a wild entourage of fellow punks, another band of misfits, adding fuel to the fire. Even before the cameras rolled, chaos brewed backstage. In a moment of disastrous judgment, the producers offered the young punks alcohol, pouring gasoline onto their already volatile spirits. And then, the broadcast began. What unfolded live on British television wasn't just rebellion, it was raw, unfiltered outrage, a ferocious outcry from a youth who had nothing left to lose. Within moments, profanity and sneers exploded through the airwaves, words and attitudes never before seen. In polite British living rooms. By morning, the headlines were ablaze with a single burning question. Who are these punks? The answer was clear and unapologetic. They were the Sex Pistols. That night marked a turning point in British culture, catapulting the band to stardom while sealing their fate on a path of chaos and eventual collapse. And at the center of this impending storm was a future member who would become both their most iconic and most tragic figure, Sid Vicious. Welcome to another episode of The Bone Collector, where today we dive deep into not only the story of the Sex Pistols, but more importantly, the haunting life and untimely death of Sid Vicious and the dark, violent crime that would forever stain his legacy. The search for a frontman was desperate, relentless. The band, along with their circle of misfits, scoured the gritty streets and punk hangouts of London. They weren't looking for polished voices or technical skill. They were hunting for attitude, for someone who lived and breathed punk. But time and time again, the scene disappointed them. Many young men who looked the part refused the offer, unwilling to throw themselves into the chaos. Worse still, most of them wore long hair, the complete opposite of the sharp, aggressive image the punk scene demanded. That all changed in August of 1975. There he was, a 19-year-old kid wearing a t-shirt boldly stating, "I hate Pink Floyd." His name? John Lydon, a troubled-looking youth, gap-toothed and unpredictable. But unlike the others, John said yes. At his first audition, Lydon walked in with his hair dyed green, exuding defiance. For his tryout song, he chose "I'm 18" by Alice Cooper, delivering it not with finesse, but with raw, snarling energy. It was exactly what they were looking for. He was in. With Lydon, soon to be known as Johnny Rotten, officially on board, the Sex Pistols began to take shape. But as some doors opened, others closed. Nick Kent, a journalist and occasional guitarist for the band, drifted away. In search of a replacement, the Pistols placed a blunt ad, "Wanted. Teenage guitar prodigy, no older than 20. Must be no worse than Johnny Thunders." Their search brought in Steve New as a second guitarist, playing alongside Steve Jones. But news time with the band was fleeting, gone within a month. Amid all this chaos, the band decided on a name that would shake the very foundations of polite society: Sex Pistols. a name sharp enough to provoke and young enough to seduce. Their first official gig came in November 1975 at the St. Martin's School of Art. From that moment on, London's college scene couldn't get enough of them. And the image? The image was everything. By the spring of 1976, the Sex Pistols had crafted a look that screamed defiance. Leather, jackets covered in spikes, pins, and hand-painted slogans. Torn shirts and chains. Anti-fashion. As a statement of rebellion. Meanwhile, Malcolm McLaren's shop, now simply called SEX, exploded in popularity, selling shocking t-shirts with hand-scrawled messages and offensive imagery. Punk wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a way to wear your rage on your chest. With ripped jeans, combat boots, and safety pins piercing their skin and clothes, the punks became walking, snarling billboards of anarchy. And at the center of it all stood the Sex Pistols, the perfect messengers for the chaos of their generation. Their raw energy caught the press's attention for the first time in February 1976. Critics mocked their musical ability but couldn't ignore the havoc they unleashed on stage. The Sex Pistols weren't just a band, they were a force of nature. They tore through London's most notorious venues, from back alley pubs to the legendary 100 Club, electrifying the youth and horrifying the establishment. Punk rock wasn't just the sound of the future, it was the weapon of a restless, angry generation. But along with fame came infamy. Brawls, riots, and chaos followed them everywhere. Almost overnight, the Sex Pistols became both heroes and villains of a cultural revolution. Meanwhile, across the ocean, another punk explosion was happening, the Ramones. But to quote you, the Pistols, these shaggy-haired Americans didn't fit the mold. Too neat, too clean. The Five. British punks wanted something rougher, meaner, more dangerous. By mid-1976, the Sex Pistols were playing far beyond London, bringing their message of mayhem to the industrial towns of northern England. In May and June, they played two legendary shows at Manchester's Free Trade Hall, gigs that would ignite the entire Manchester punk scene. And soon, they weren't alone. New bands like The Clash and The Damned emerged, opening for the Sex Pistols and forming a rough alliance. Even the Pistols, on a rare night off, found themselves at a Ramones gig at the iconic Dingwalls Club. Curiosity beating out rivalry, if only for a night. With every show, the Sex Pistols churned out new songs filled with razor-sharp lyrics of defiance, disgust, and destruction. Their revolution was no longer brewing, it was already here. By September 1976, the Sex Pistols were no longer confined to London's back alleys and grimy pubs. They hit the road, taking their chaotic message across Britain. And in October, they signed a major record deal with EMI, a move that stunned the music industry. Suddenly, this band of punks, once seen as outcasts, were now recording in the same studios as rock royalty. Working with renowned producer Chris Thomas, best known for engineering Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon, the Pistols began cutting their first singles. The results? Loud, raw, and unapologetic. Even the record sleeves reflected their attitude, black covers, stripped, of titles or imagery, pure rebellion, pressed onto vinyl. But as their music spread, so did their infamy. The media swarmed them, obsessed with their every move. Concert after concert was canceled by fearful venue owners and cautious city officials, terrified of what the Pistols and their increasingly wild fans might unleash. Still, the Pistols pushed forward. By January 1977, they had lined up a string of shows in the Netherlands, but their growing notoriety followed them wherever they went. On the 4th of January 1977, the band stumbled into Heathrow Airport, hungover and barely standing. Witnesses claimed they were vomiting on the way to their flight, a scene the Jono tabloids devoured. In the eyes of the public, the Pistols weren't just a band anymore, they were the embodiment of Britain's moral decay. The backlash was swift. Under mounting pressure, EMI dropped the Sex Pistols just months after signing them. But rather than kill their momentum, the controversy only fueled their legend. The chaos didn't stop there. In February, manager Malcolm McLaren made a shocking announcement. Bassist Glenn Matlock was leaving the band. The reason? According to McLaren, Glenn talked too much about Paul McCartney and, worse, liked the Beatles. But the truth ran deeper. Though Matlock was a talented songwriter, he didn't fit the band's image. His clean-cut personality clashed with the Pistols' anarchic ethos. And so, the search began for someone who didn't just play punk, but lived it. Enter Sid Vicious. At 19, Sid was chaotic, unpredictable, and troubled. Exactly what the Sex Pistols needed. He wasn't much of a bassist, but he had the look, the attitude, and the complete disregard for authority that defined the punk spirit. Born John Simon Ritchie, Sid grew up in the rough streets of southeast London. His father, a jazz trombonist and former palace guard, abandoned the family early on. His mother, Anne Beverly, struggled with addiction and at one point resorted to selling drugs to keep them afloat. Eventually, Sid and his mother moved to East London, where he met John Lydon. Their bond would become legendary. But behind Sid's tough exterior was a young man battling deep personal demons. At Westminster Kingsway College, he confided in counselors about his drug use and suicidal thoughts, cries for help that seemed to fall on deaf ears. At just 16, Sid was kicked out of his home, forced to survive on the streets, relying on friends and strangers. There's a story, almost too strange not to be true, about how he got his infamous name. One day, Lydon's pet hamster, also named Sid, bit Ritchie on the hand. Laughing, John declared, "Sid is really vicious." The nickname stuck. From that moment on, John Simon Ritchie became Sid Vicious. Sid was part of a tight-knit group known as the Four Johns, there's four friends, all named John, who spent their days haunting Malcolm McLaren's boutique, soaking up the punk lifestyle. Before joining the Pistols, Sid played on the streets with Lydon, John on violin, Sid on acoustic guitar. Their performances were so dreadful that people sometimes paid them just to stop playing. In 1976, Sid co-founded the Flowers of Romance, a short-lived band where he took up vocals and saxophone, alongside guitarist Keith Levine. Though his musical abilities were questionable, his stage presence was undeniable. And so, the final piece of the Sex Pistols fell into place. With Sid on board, the band had its ultimate weapon, unpredictable, volatile, and dangerously charismatic. What followed would be a whirlwind of destruction, rebellion, and tragedy, a story that would burn bright and fast, leaving scars on everyone it touched. During this chaotic period, Sid Vicious was still learning how to play the bass. His teacher, a worn-out copy of the Ramones' first album, spinning endlessly on his record player. But Sid's education in punk wasn't just musical, it was brutal, raw, and lived on the streets. In the summer of 1976, Sid attended a Sex Pistols gig at the notorious 100 Club, where chaos was always just a heartbeat away. There, Sid found himself face-to-face with Nick Kent, a former Sex Pistols guitarist turned journalist. The story goes that Kent was blocking Sid's view of the stage. Sid, never one for patience, responded the only way he knew how, by swinging a motorcycle chain at Kent's head. The blow opened a deep gash, leaving Kent bloodied and stunned. Remarkably, Nick chose not to press charges. But that was just the beginning of Sid's violent reputation. Later that year, at another 100 Club show, this time featuring The Damned, Sid took things further. Drunk and high on amphetamines, he hurled a glass toward the stage. But instead of hitting his target, the glass smashed against a pillar, sending shards flying into the crowd. One fragment struck a young girl in the eye, blinding her permanently. Sid was arrested, and the aftermath was severe. The 100 Club, once the beating heart of London's punk scene, banned punk rock performances indefinitely. And yet, in the middle of all this chaos, the Sex Pistols made a decision that would change their fate forever. They invited Sid to join the band. Everyone knew his track record. They knew he was unpredictable, violent, and wild. But, somehow, that felt right. Sid didn't fit in, and that's exactly why he belonged. At first, Sid's eccentric personality seemed to complement the Pistols' anarchic energy. But when the rehearsals began, the truth became painfully clear. Sid couldn't play. He barely knew his instrument. But by then, the Sex Pistols were no longer just a band. They had become a spectacle, a living, breathing controversy where the music was almost secondary. Sid understood this. And instead of trying to be a great bassist, he embraced his role as Punk's ultimate wild child. He was having the time of his life, basking in media attention, blowing through money, and enjoying the chaos his mere presence created. But the party wouldn't last forever. Sid's playful grin soon gave way to a darker side as he sank deeper into addiction. And everything changed when he met Nancy Spungen, a 19-year-old sex worker from New York, with a tragic past and her own deep scars. Nancy's story was as troubled as Sid's. Born into chaos, she nearly died at birth, strangled by her own umbilical cord. Doctors assured her parents there was no brain damage, but Nancy's childhood told a different story. As a baby, she was colicky, violent, and inconsolable. By the time she was 3 months old, her pediatrician prescribed barbiturates, an early sign of a life shaped by medication and struggle. The warning signs kept piling up. At age 10, Nancy allegedly threatened her babysitter with scissors and attacked her psychiatrist. The diagnosis? A desperate hunger for attention wrapped in violent outbursts. By 11, Nancy was expelled from school for chronic absenteeism. Her parents sent her to a boarding school in Pennsylvania, hoping for a fresh start. But Nancy ran away and attempted suicide. At 15, she was officially diagnosed with schizophrenia. Despite this, she managed to graduate from high school in 1974 and was accepted into the University of Colorado at Boulder, ATO. Brief glimpse of a normal life. But trouble found her again. Nancy was arrested for trying to buy marijuana from an undercover cop. Later, she was caught hiding stolen goods in her dorm. The university expelled her, and she soon left home for good. At 17, Nancy landed in New York City, where she fell into street life, turning to sex work to survive. It was there, in the dark underbelly of Manhattan's punk scene, that Nancy and Sid's paths would cross, a collision course of two broken souls spiraling toward tragedy. Interestingly, before her descent into chaos, Nancy Spungen had briefly tried to build a more conventional life. She dabbled as an amateur music journalist, working part-time in clothing stores, and mingled with some of the biggest rock bands of the era: Aerosmith, Bad Company, the New York Dolls, and the Ramones. But her story took a sharp turn in December 1976 when she traveled to London with the Heartbreakers. It was there, in the smoke-filled clubs of the city's punk underground, that she first crossed paths with the Sex Pistols and with Sid Vicious. Their connection wasn't instant, but something dark had been set in motion. About a year later, Sid and Nancy became inseparable. By then, Nancy was a full-blown heroin addict, emotionally shattered and spiraling deeper into darkness. Sid, already walking a thin line, followed her down the same destructive path. His drug use skyrocketed, and he began pulling away from the band that had made him famous. Johnny Rotten, Sid's longtime friend and frontman of the Pistols, saw the danger immediately. He later described Nancy as being on a slow-motion suicide mission, and she was determined to take Sid down with her. The cracks in Sid's life soon split wide open. In March 1977, the Sex Pistols signed a new record deal with A&M Records, staging a chaotic press event outside Buckingham Palace itself, the heart of British royalty. The band showed up drunk. Sid, true to form, took it a step further, smashing a toilet in the A&M offices, while Johnny Rotten launched into a verbal attack on the label's staff. Days later, chaos erupted again. During a pub brawl, friends of the Pistols allegedly threatened an associate of A&M's managing director. That was the final straw. A&M tore up the contract, severing ties with the band. Worse still, nearly 25,000 copies of their first single, God Save the Queen, were destroyed before they could ever hit the shelves. But punk thrived on rejection. Soon after, the Pistols signed with Virgin Records, and God Save the Queen was finally released. Its launch, however, would become one of the most controversial moments in music history. The song's lyrics were an all-out assault on British tradition. Its cover featured Queen Elizabeth II's face defaced with ransom note-style lettering, a visual insult to the monarchy itself. The track's most infamous lines sneered, "She ain't no human being. There is no future in England's dreaming." The backlash was immediate. The BBC and nearly every major radio station banned the Barbacks' song outright, and countless retailers refused to stock the single. It became the most censored record in British history. But in a brilliant stroke of punk irony, the controversy only made the song bigger. Timed to coincide with Queen Elizabeth's Silver Jubilee celebrations, God Save the Queen sold over 150,000 copies in 2 weeks, despite almost zero radio airplay. Then came their most audacious stunt yet. The Pistols hired a boat and staged a rogue concert sailing down the River Thames, passing Westminster Pier and Parliament itself, right in the heart of the royal festivities. As they screamed their anthem of anarchy, London's Metropolitan Police stormed the boat, ending the Frumman show in chaos and arresting several members of the crew and band. Meanwhile, God Save the Queen soared to number 2 on the UK singles chart, though many believed it was deliberately blocked from taking the top spot. The Sex Pistols fan base exploded overnight, drawing in a new wave of disaffected youth. Punk had become more than a sound. It was now a full-fledged cultural rebellion. But fame brought enemies. One night, Johnny Rotten was brutally attacked by a gang armed with knives at the Pegasus pub in Islington. He suffered serious injuries, including torn tendons in his left arm. Just 3 days later, he was attacked again. Violence became a constant shadow trailing the Pistols, and local gangs began targeting the band members wherever they played. To survive, the Pistols began using a pseudonym, the Spots, to secretly book their gigs and avoid being ambushed. Through it all, Malcolm McLaren, ever the opportunist, had another idea brewing. He wanted to turn the chaos into cinema, using the Pistols story as the basis for a film. And so, while the band teetered on the edge of collapse, McLaren began working on what would become another chapter in the band's explosive, tragic legacy. In the aftermath of their Thames River stunt, the Sex Pistols' rebellious image only grew larger. Short films surfaced, capturing moments from the notorious river incident, fueling the band's mythos and electrifying their growing fan base. But behind the scenes, Sid Vicious was spiraling fast. His musical shortcomings became painfully obvious. During studio sessions, Johnny Rotten and the other members did everything they could to keep Sid away from the recording process. This exclusion frustrated Sid, leaving him with more free time he spent in a drug-fueled haze with Nancy. In November 1977, Sid showed up at a rehearsal room, ready to work through the band's set list. But the other 3 members, it didn't show. This wasn't the first time that week. Agitated and feeling abandoned, Sid's frustration boiled over. These rehearsals were crucial. Malcolm McLaren was frantically piecing together a U.S. tour, and the clock was ticking. To make things worse, McLaren's grand plan for a Sex Pistols movie had just been shelved, sending the band's morale into freefall. But Sid didn't mourn the failed film. He thought it would have killed the band's raw spirit anyway. In an interview, Sid famously boasted, "I'm the best bass player in the universe," before admitting it was stupid that the Pistols existed only to tour and argue. Still, not everything was bleak. Sid recalled one show around that time as incredible, but those moments of joy were quickly drowned by missed rehearsals and endless fights. Soon after, Sid's mental state collapsed further. Staying at London's Ambassador Hotel, he snapped. In a moment of despair, Sid tried to jump from a 3rd-story window. Nancy, barely able to stop him, grabbed hold of him at the last second. But Sid, enraged by her interference, lashed out, grabbing her hair and slamming her head against the wall until she bled. When Nancy began to slip into unconsciousness, Sid suddenly broke down in tears. 2 hours later, a hotel receptionist, having heard the violent commotion, burst into the room. Horrified by the bloodstains on the walls, she called the police. Nancy, dazed and bruised, refused to press charges. The authorities confiscated one of her prescription drugs, but in the end, both were released. The tabloids, however, pounced on the story, spinning it into another scandal that pushed the Sex Pistols' reputation to new lows. The band had finally had enough. They tried to send Nancy back to New York, coordinating with tour organizers to get her on a plane. But Nancy, always one step ahead, figured out the plan and refused to leave. Sid, infuriated, withdrew further from the band, drowning himself in heroin alongside Nancy. Despite all of this, the Pistols pressed on, heading to America for their much-hyped U.S. tour, a tour already plagued by visa issues. Johnny Rotten's criminal record delayed their plans, forcing them to cancel several dates across the Northeast. The tour barely got started before things fell apart. In Memphis, Sid was arrested for trying to score drugs. Shortly after his release, he was jumped and beaten by security staff from Warner Brothers, the record label promoting the tour. And then came one of the most infamous moments of Sid's life. Before a show, he carved "Gimme a Fix" into his chest with a razor blade, an open cry for help that horrified the press, and fueled his legend as punk's most self-destructive icon. The chaos only escalated. In San Antonio, Sid stumbled on stage, insulted the audience, and was promptly hit in the head by a flying beer can. In another city, he swung his bass at a fan during a fight in the crowd. Dallas was even worse. Suffering intense heroin withdrawal, Sid spat blood at a fan who had jumped on stage. The woman punched him in the face, knocking him down. Sid stumbled off stage only to pick another fight, this time with a photographer and a security guard. The next morning, battered and bleeding, Sid was admitted to a hospital. But Sid wasn't the only one losing control. Backstage, Johnny Rotten was sinking into his own drug binges, detached from reality. Guitarist Steve Jones and drummer Paul Cook later recalled how impossible it had become to keep the band functioning. If they looked away for even a second, Sid would start a fight. And Johnny? He was lost in his own self-destruction, convinced the end was inevitable. The Sex Pistols were no longer a band. They were a slow-motion train wreck, and the crash was coming fast. And so, after just 7 chaotic shows, the Sex Pistols' American dream came crashing down. The tensions between Johnny Rotten and Malcolm McLaren finally exploded, leaving the band teetering on the edge of collapse. Cities across the U.S. that had waited eagerly for the Pistols' arrival were left with nothing but broken promises and canceled gigs. On the 17th of January, 1978, the band headed to Los Angeles, fractured and exhausted. Sid Vicious was in shambles, physically wasted and mentally unraveling. With the help of a friend, he barely made it to New York City, where a dangerous cocktail of Valium and methadone landed him in the hospital. Johnny Rotten paid him a visit. Looking at his broken friend, he realized with cold clarity, this was the end. The Sex Pistols were over. The next night, at the final Sex Pistols show, performed without Sid, Johnny stood before the crowd and ended it all with a single bitter phrase, "Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?" The following day, with the help of Virgin Records' Richard Branson, Johnny caught a flight back to London, leaving the chaos behind. Meanwhile, Sid stayed in New York, wrapped in a toxic embrace with Nancy Spungen, spiraling further into addiction and self-destruction. The remaining Pistols, along with McLaren, began working on a film chronicling the band's story, twisting their downfall into part of the myth. But Johnny Rotten refused to participate, distancing himself from the spectacle. Instead, he prepared a lawsuit against McLaren and their management company Glitterbest, accusing them of unpaid royalties, unauthorized use of the Johnny Rotten name, and creating a criminal environment that had destroyed the band. While the legal battles brewed, Johnny was already building his next chapter. Alongside ex-Clash member Keith Levine and school friend Ja Wobble, he formed Public Image Limited, APLE, a post-punk experiment that would soon crack the UK top 10 with the single, Public Image. But across the Atlantic, Sid's life was sliding into darkness. Sid and Nancy took up residence at the infamous Chelsea Hotel in Manhattan, a place where artists, addicts, and outcasts drifted through life's shadows. Nancy took over as Sid's self-appointed manager while he toyed with a solo career. In September 1978, Sid began recording tracks for what would have been his first solo release. But as with everything in his life, tragedy wasn't far behind. On the morning of the 12th of October, 1978, the Chelsea Hotel front desk received a chilling call. Upstairs, in room 100, the body of Nancy Spungen was found crumpled on the bathroom floor. A deep stab wound to her abdomen had ended her life. Sid was found by hotel staff wandering the hallways, glassy-eyed and disoriented. He was 88 and arrested by Sergeant Thomas Kilroy and brought in for questioning. At first, Through a haze of withdrawal and confusion, Sid admitted they had fought that night. He confessed to stabbing her, but claimed he hadn't meant to kill her. Later, as he sobered up, his story changed. He said he couldn't remember anything. The investigation revealed that Sid and Nancy had hosted a chaotic drug-fueled party in their room the night before. Dozens of guests came and went, making it impossible to track who had been there when Nancy died. Some witnesses claimed she was alive as late as 5 a.m. Others insisted that Sid was too incoherent to have committed the murder. Still, with Sid's initial confession and a bloodied knife found in the room, a Jaguar K11, ironically purchased by Nancy days earlier as a gift for Sid, police charged him with second-degree murder. As news spread, Malcolm McLaren rushed to hire the best legal defense he could find, but doors were closing fast. Eventually, an attorney from the Pistols' own management team stepped in to handle Sid's defense. And just like that, one of punk rock's brightest and most tragic stars found himself locked in a jail cell, waiting for a trial that would never come. Malcolm McLaren, ever the manipulator, managed to secure Sid's release on bail minus $50,000, paid by Virgin Records, the very label that had once fueled the Sex Pistols' rise. But Sid's freedom came with conditions. He was to remain in New York and report daily to the police. After his release, Sid returned to the Chelsea Hotel, where his mother, Anne Beverly, and Malcolm tried to care for him. Both clung to the belief that Sid was innocent. Sid's lawyer built his defense on a theory. The murder weapon, a Jaguar K11 knife, had been kept in the same drawer as the couple's cash. According to this story, one of the party guests from that chaotic night tried to steal their money, and Nancy caught them in the act, leading to her death. To investigate the claim, McLaren hired private detectives and brought in forensic expert Stephen Teach to interview Sid. But the conversation went nowhere. Sid, lost in a drugged haze, stared blankly at a television screen and rambled about the working class in Berlin, utterly disconnected from reality. Stephen left the meeting deeply disturbed. He warned that Sid should never be left alone, but no one listened. Hours later, Sid broke down. In a violent outburst, he slashed his wrists with a broken light bulb, then tried to jump out of his hotel window, only to be stopped at the last second. Emergency responders rushed him to Bellevue Hospital, where he was stabilized and later transferred to a psychiatric unit in White Plains. On the 26th of November, Sid was discharged and returned to the Chelsea Hotel, a shadow of himself. By then, Johnny Rotten had learned of the tragedy and tried to reach out to his old friend, but McLaren blocked any contact. 2 days later, Sid gave a haunting interview to journalist Bernard Clark. When asked about Nancy's death, Sid coldly replied, "She always said she wouldn't live to see 21. And when Clark asked Sid where he'd like to be at that moment, Sid answered softly, "I'd like to be under the ground." As Christmas approached, the remaining Sex Pistols reunited briefly, recording a cynical Christmas album to raise money for Sid's defense. They even sold T-shirts with the grim slogan, "She's dead, I'm alive, I'm yours." Meanwhile, Sid drifted further from reality. As the legal process dragged on, he jumped from one toxic relationship to another. He dated punk sinister Lynn Jewel Nylon, and later fell into drug-fueled affairs with Connie Grip, an ex-girlfriend of Dee Dee Ramone, and Michelle Robinson. On the 5th of December, Sid attended a party at the Hurrah nightclub, where punk band The Sick, F. Kex were performing. There, Sid drunkenly flirted with Terry, the band's drummer. When she rejected him, Sid lashed out, pinching her aggressively. Her boyfriend, Todd Smith, stepped in to protect her. In response, Sid smashed a beer bottle and attacked Todd, slashing his face so badly he required 5 stitches. The police were called. Sid was arrested and brought to court. The judge ruled that Sid had violated his bail conditions and ordered him back into custody. But before heading back to jail, Sid was sent to detox. After nearly a month behind bars, Sid returned to court. This time, bail was set at $10,000 and the conditions were stricter. He now had to report to the police 3 times a week. He was banned from nightclubs, and he was required to continue drug rehabilitation at Rikers Island. Despite the worsening chaos, his defense team saw a silver lining. They believed the bar fight painted Sid as unstable, not murderous, a narrative they could use in court. Even his mother, Anne Beverly, told reporters, "Now the world will see my boy for what he truly is, a good kid." But fate had other plans. On the morning of the 1st of February, 1979, Sid Vicious was released from Rikers Island, having completed a detox program. He left the jail clean, at least for the moment. He headed into Manhattan, where he reunited with his old friend Peter Kotick Gravel, a fixture of the London punk scene. And what happened next would shock everyone, bringing the punk tragedy full circle. That night, Sid Vicious spent hours talking with his old friend Peter Kotick Gravel, pouring out the emptiness he felt. Eventually, Sid asked for what had always been his escape, heroin. Peter secured the drugs and brought them back to the apartment where Sid was, staying surrounded by a mix of punks, misfits, and hangers-on, including his mother Anne, Beverly, and Michelle Robinson, the apartment's owner. Members of the punk scene drifted in and out, figures from the Misfits, the Heartbreakers, and other New York bands. The heroin flowed freely, and as the night wore on, people began to leave, one by one, leaving Sid and a few others behind in a thick fog of drugs and regret. Around 11 p.m., Jerry Only of the Misfits noticed Sid nodding off. Concerned, he tried to shake him awake, but Anne gently covered her son with a blanket, assuring Jerry that Sid would be fine. Jerry, knowing Sid had been clean for a short while, reluctantly let it go. Later, Peter Gravel gave Sid 4 barbiturates to help him sleep. By morning, Sid Vicious was gone. Anne Beverly and Michelle Robinson found his body at dawn. Paramedics were called, but it was too late. Sid had overdosed during the night, his heart finally giving out. Anne claimed it wasn't an accident. She later said she had found a note tucked into one of Sid's jackets, a suicide pact between him and Nancy. In the letter, Sid had written that he wanted to be buried beside her, that if anything happened to Nancy, he would follow. Nancy's sister, Deborah Spungen, confirmed that during his time in detox, Sid had written to the family, promising he would take his own life if Nancy couldn't be with him. But Sid's final wish could not be fulfilled. Nancy was buried in a Jewish cemetery in Pennsylvania, where Sid could not be laid to rest. Instead, his body was cremated in New Jersey. Anne Beverly, unable to let go of her son's promise, traveled to Nancy's grave with a few friends. From outside the cemetery fence, they scattered Sid's ashes near her tombstone, and a blos, outlaw goodbye, fitting for their tragic love story. The death of Sid Vicious shocked the world, igniting endless speculation. Some claimed it was suicide. Others believed it was a tragic accident. But no matter the truth, Sid's death became one of the most iconic and haunting moments in the history of rock and roll. For days, his face covered newspapers around the globe, alongside dramatic headlines recounting the stormy, drug-fueled romance between him and Nancy, a modern-day punk, Romeo and Juliet. Months later, the solo album Sid had been working on was finally released. On its cover, a chilling image of Sid's body being carried from the apartment where he died, forever frozen, in that final, tragic moment. The album was met with critical fascination and fan worship. To many, Sid had become punk's ultimate martyr, the skinny, sneering rebel who lived fast and died young. But not everyone bought into the myth. Johnny Rotten, his former friend and bandmate, offered a stark truth. Everything good in Sid died the moment he joined the Sex Pistols. He believed Sid's downfall was rooted in his feelings of inadequacy, knowing he wasn't the best musician in the band. In 1986, the story of Sid and Nancy was immortalized in the cult film Sid and Nancy. Love Kills, which portrayed Sid as a lost, confused soul, hopelessly trapped in a world he couldn't escape. The film's sympathetic tone gave their story a heartbreaking humanity. Years later, Sid's most famous instrument, his Fender precision bass, white with a black pickguard and a leather strap engraved with his name, was auctioned off to former Pistols guitarist Steve Jones for around $2,000, roughly $12,000 in today's money. Even Sid's iconic tattered suit would eventually go to auction, selling for nearly $6,300, a reminder of the punk king who burned out far too soon. Today, Sid Vicious remains a tragic legend, both a cautionary tale and a symbol of punk rock's raw, self-destructive heart. In 2006, the Sex Pistols were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a recognition that most bands would have embraced. But true to form, the surviving members refused to attend the ceremony, dismissing the event as corporate nonsense. Even in death, their legacy refused to be tamed. Years later, in January 2021, FX announced a bold new project, a scripted television series chronicling the rise and fall of the Sex Pistols. Released the following year, the series divided audiences. Some saw it as a raw portrait of punk's chaotic birth. Others, like Johnny Rotten himself, called it an insult to their story. Rotten publicly condemned the series, labeling it disrespectful and inaccurate. He even launched a legal battle to stop the producers from using the Pistols' music, but the courts ruled against him. Decades after the tragic deaths of Nancy Spungen and Sid Vicious, their dark love story, cultural impact continued to haunt the world. And with that haunting came endless theories about what really happened the night Nancy died. The official investigation ended with Sid's death, leaving many questions unanswered and the truth forever lost to time. In 2007, author Phil Strongman reignited the mystery with his book, proposing an alternative suspect, the actor and known punk scene figure Rockets Redglare. According to Strongman, Rockets was aware of the stash of cash Sid and Nancy kept in a drawer and had been present at the party the night she died. Rockets denied the accusations, but some close to him claimed he had privately confessed to the murder on multiple occasions. The problem? Rockets was infamous for telling wild, exaggerated stories to grab attention, making him a suspect as unreliable as he was. Intriguing. Strongman's book also pointed to another possible figure, Neon Leon, a local punk who lived in the Chelsea Hotel. Neon was later found in possession of some of Sid's belongings, including his iconic leather jacket. When questioned, Neon claimed Sid had given him the items as a gift and agreed to return them. Suspicion followed Neon for years. Some claimed he privately admitted to knowing who killed Nancy, though he never revealed a name. Later, he denied ever saying it. But despite all the speculation, many still believe Sid Vicious was the only real suspect. Friends close to the couple spoke openly about the toxic and violent nature of their bad-of-ass relationship. While Sid was often soft-spoken in public, behind closed doors it was a different story. Nancy herself once confided in Nora Forster, John Lydon's partner, admitting that Sid sometimes hit her. Nancy's mother also told police that her daughter confessed the bruises she carried weren't from strangers, they were from Sid. Yet, others described Nancy as equally abusive, verbally tearing Sid down and physically attacking him during their volatile fights. Their relationship was a whirlwind of passion, destruction, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The police believe Sid's initial confession, the positioning of Nancy's body, the location of the knife, and the chaotic nature of their relationship all pointed to his guilt. But because the case was never closed, Nancy Spungen's murder remains an unsolved mystery, with Sid forever cast as the most likely suspect. Perhaps, in some ways, the public's romanticization of Sid Vicious, their idolization of his broken, rebellious spirit, has kept his guilt blurred in a fog of doubt. Sid Vicious' death is remembered not just as another tragic chapter in rock history, but as the inevitable crash of a life driven by chaos, excess, and pain. He became both the poster child for punk's raw defiance and the cautionary tale of its most destructive extremes. And so, the legend of Sid and Nancy lives on, a love story soaked in blood, noise, and nihilism.